The auctioneer's voice echoed through the River Valley Community Center as I watched strangers rifle through the remnants of my life. Equipment I'd saved months to buy, furniture Sarah and I had picked out together, even the vintage beer tap handles that had been my pride and joy. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just another curious onlooker in the back row. I was the anonymous bidder who'd been quietly outbidding them all morning, and I was about to teach some very familiar faces a lesson they'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday in what had become my new routine. I pressed the brew button on the single-cup coffee maker in my cramped Pinewood Apartments kitchenette, the same ritual I'd performed every day for the past 8 months since everything fell apart. The machine gurgled to life, filling the silence that had become my constant companion. Through the thin walls I could hear Mrs. Patterson next door turning on her morning talk shows, the familiar chatter of hosts discussing topics that felt worlds away from my reality. I pulled my phone from the charger and scrolled through the usual notifications. Email reminders about overdue bills I was slowly chipping away at, a few LinkedIn messages from former industry contacts who'd heard about Cascade Brewing's closure, and then something that made my stomach drop. A text message from Janet Mills, time-stamped just after midnight. Hope you're doing okay, Marcus. Saw the auction listing online. I'm really sorry it came to this. The auction listing, I'd been dreading this day for months ever since the bankruptcy court ordered the liquidation of Cascade Brewing's assets. Everything I'd built over 7 years, every piece of equipment I'd researched and saved for, every detail that had made my brewery special, was being sold off to the highest bidder. The irony wasn't lost on me that the business I'd poured my heart into would be dismantled piece by piece in the same community center where I'd first pitched the concept to local investors. I set the phone down and focused on getting dressed. Dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, and my least worn pair of sneakers. I wanted to blend in, to be just another face in the crowd. The plan I'd been working on for the past month required anonymity, at least for now. I grabbed the leather portfolio from my desk, double-checking that all the necessary paperwork was inside. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, and most importantly, the corporate documents for Clearwater Capital Holdings, the shell company I'd quietly established 6 weeks ago. The drive to the community center took 12 minutes, the same route I'd taken countless times when Cascade Brewing was thriving. Past the elementary school where Sarah used to volunteer for reading programs, past the park where we'd walked our golden retriever Max before the divorce, past the corner market where I'd buy flowers for her on random Tuesday afternoons just because. Those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life now, distant and faded like old photographs. I parked 3 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, wanting to observe the scene before making my presence known. The parking lot was busier than I'd expected. Local restaurant owners looking for commercial equipment, antique dealers hoping to find hidden treasures, and the usual crowd of auction regulars who showed up to every estate sale and liquidation in the county. But as I got closer to the entrance, I spotted the faces I'd been both dreading and anticipating seeing. Sarah stood near the registration table, her blonde hair styled in the sleek bob she'd adopted after our separation. She wore a burgundy wool coat I'd never seen before, expensive-looking boots, and carried herself with the confidence of someone whose life was moving in an upward trajectory. Next to her, Tyler Brooks examined a clipboard with the intensity of a serious bidder. His presence here shouldn't have surprised me, but it still felt like a punch to the chest. 6 months ago, Tyler had been just another craft beer enthusiast who frequented my taproom. Now he was Sarah's live-in boyfriend and apparently interested in acquiring pieces of my failed dream. Janet stood a few feet away from them, scrolling through her phone with the same nervous energy she'd always had before important meetings. We'd been business partners for 3 years before everything went sideways, and seeing her here felt like the final confirmation that our friendship hadn't survived the collapse of Cascade Brewing. She'd been my head of operations, the person I'd trusted with every aspect of the business except the financial decisions that ultimately doomed us. But it was the fourth familiar face that surprised me most. David, my younger brother, emerged from the community center carrying a folded piece of paper, clearly having already registered for bidding. We hadn't spoken since the explosive argument in the lawyer's office 4 months ago, when he'd accused me of being irresponsible with money and dragging the family name through the mud. Seeing him here, presumably to bid on remnants of my business, felt like the ultimate betrayal. I took a deep breath and approached the registration table, keeping my voice steady as I spoke to the volunteer manning the sign-in process. "I'd like to register for bidding, please." She handed me a clipboard with the standard forms, and I filled everything out using the Clearwater Capital Holdings information. When she asked for identification, I showed her the corporate paperwork that established me as the company's authorized representative. To anyone looking, I was just Marcus Chen from a Portland-based investment firm, not the former owner watching his life's work get sold off. The volunteer handed me bidding paddle number 47 and directed me toward the preview area where potential buyers could examine the items before bidding began. I made my way through the crowd, careful to avoid eye contact with the people.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I knew. The brewery equipment was arranged in the center of the room, each piece tagged with lot numbers and minimum bid amounts. My stainless steel fermentation tanks, the bottling line I'd spent 2 years saving for, the grain mill that had been the first major purchase I'd made when expanding operations. Sarah and Tyler were examining the draft system, the elaborate setup of taps and lines that had been the centerpiece of my tap room. I watched from a distance as Tyler ran his hands along the chrome surfaces, nodding approvingly at whatever Sarah was telling him. Their body language suggested familiarity with the equipment, like they'd been planning this acquisition for some time. The realization hit me that they weren't just here to pick up a few pieces at bargain prices. They were here to buy out the core of my operation. Janet had moved on to the smaller items, the collection of branded glassware and promotional materials that had taken years to accumulate. She picked up one of the pint glasses with the Cascade Brewing logo, turning it over in her hands with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment she looked up and our eyes met across the crowded room. I saw recognition flash across her face, followed immediately by something that looked like guilt or shame. She quickly looked away and moved to a different section of the preview area. David was focused on the office equipment and furniture, examining the desk where I'd spent countless late nights working on recipes and business plans. The computer monitor where I'd tracked sales and managed inventory, the filing cabinet full of vendor contracts and regulatory paperwork that no longer mattered. He seemed particularly interested in a vintage beer advertisement collection I'd acquired over the years, original signs and posters that had decorated the taproom walls. The preview period lasted 30 minutes, giving me plenty of time to observe and plan. I made notes in a small notebook, not about the items themselves since I knew every piece intimately, but about the bidding patterns I expected to see. Sarah and Tyler would likely focus on the core brewing equipment, probably with the intention of starting their own operation or supplying an existing one. Janet might go for the smaller items with sentimental value, things she could use to remember the good times before everything fell apart. David would probably stick to items he could easily resell or repurpose. When the auctioneer called for everyone to take their seats, I chose a spot in the back corner where I could see the entire room but remain relatively inconspicuous. The auctioneer was a professional from Pacific Northwest Asset Recovery, a woman in her 50s with the rapid-fire speaking style that comes from years of practice. She began with a brief overview of the terms and conditions, reminding everyone that all sales were final and payment was due immediately upon winning a bid. The first few lots were minor items, cleaning supplies and basic tools that went for reasonable prices to various local buyers. I didn't participate in these early rounds, content to observe and let others establish the room's bidding rhythm. But I could feel the anticipation building as we approached the major equipment, the items that had brought most of the serious bidders here today. Lot number 15 was my grain mill, the piece of equipment that had revolutionized my brewing process when I'd finally saved enough to buy it new rather than used. The starting bid was set at $800, reasonable for equipment that had cost me nearly $4,000. Sarah raised her paddle immediately, followed by 2 restaurant owners I recognized from around town. The price climbed quickly to $1,200, then $1,500, then $2,000. I waited until the bidding slowed at $2,200 before raising my paddle for the first time. The auctioneer acknowledged the new bid, and the price jumped to $2,300. Sarah looked around the room, trying to identify the new bidder, her eyes scanning the crowd methodically, but not quite reaching my corner position. Tyler whispered something in her ear, and she raised her paddle again. $2,400. I let them think they were winning for a moment before raising my paddle again. $2,500. This pattern continued for several more rounds, with me entering just often enough to keep the price climbing but not so frequently that anyone could easily identify where the competition was coming from. By the time we reached $3,000, Sarah was looking visibly frustrated and the other bidders had dropped out. Tyler leaned over and spoke urgently in Sarah's ear, probably trying to talk her out of going higher. But I knew Sarah's competitive nature better than anyone. She'd never been able to back down from a challenge, especially when she felt like someone was deliberately trying to outmaneuver her. She raised her paddle again. 3,100. I waited for the auctioneer to call for additional bids, let the silence stretch just long enough to make Sarah think she'd won, then raised my paddle one final time. 3,200. The auctioneer called for final bids, waited the requisite amount of time, then brought down the gavel. Sold to bidder number 47. The process repeated with the next several major pieces. Each time I let the bidding develop naturally, until one of my former associates took the lead, then I'd step in to push the price higher. The fermentation tanks went for nearly double their estimated value. The bottling line sold for 40% more than I'd originally paid for it used. The draft system that Sarah and Tyler had been so interested in during the preview ended up costing them nothing because I outbid them at every turn. By the time we reached the midpoint of the auction, a pattern had clearly emerged. Someone was systematically outbidding the people who seemed most interested in the brewery equipment, driving prices well above their expected range. I could see conversations happening throughout the room, people trying to figure out who the mysterious high bidder was, and what their strategy might be. Janet had managed to win a few of the smaller lots, sentimental items like the branded pint glasses, and some promotional materials that I hadn't bothered to contest. But every time she'd shown interest in something more substantial, paddle number 47 had appeared to drive the price beyond her budget. I could see the frustration building in her posture, the way she kept looking around the room during each bidding sequence. David had been more successful with the office equipment, winning the desk and filing cabinet along with most of the vintage advertising collection. But when he'd tried to bid on the sound system that had provided music for the taproom, I'd pushed the price high enough that he'd eventually given up. The expression on his face suggested he was beginning to take the repeated outbidding personally. The tension in the room reached a peak when we got to lot number 38, the crown jewel of my brewing operation. The custom-built mash tun had been the most expensive single purchase I'd made when expanding Cascade Brewing, a piece of equipment that had allowed me to increase production capacity and improve the consistency of my recipes. The starting bid was set at $5,000, and I knew this would be the real test of everyone's commitment. Sarah and Tyler had clearly been saving their budget for this moment. Tyler raised his paddle immediately, jumping the bid to $5,500 in an obvious attempt to discourage casual bidders. A restaurant owner from the next town over countered with $6,000, but Tyler pushed it to $6,500 without hesitation. This was clearly the item they wanted most, probably the centerpiece of whatever brewing operation they were planning. I let them have a moment to feel confident, watching as Tyler whispered what looked like encouragement to Sarah. She was nodding, her posture relaxed for the first time all morning. Then I raised my paddle. 7,000. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Tyler's head snapped around as he tried to locate the source of the bid, his confident expression replaced by something closer to concern. Sarah's face flushed with the kind of anger I'd seen during our worst arguments, the look she got when she felt like someone was deliberately trying to undermine her. Tyler raised his paddle again, pushing the bid to $7,500. I countered immediately with 8,000. He went to $8,500. I made it 9,000. The other bidders had long since dropped out, leaving just the two of us in what had become a very personal battle. At $10,000, Tyler hesitated for the first time. That pause told me everything I needed to know about their budget and their level of commitment. Sarah was saying something urgent in his ear, but he was shaking his head, clearly uncomfortable with going higher. When the auctioneer called for additional bids, I raised my paddle one more time. 11,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Tyler looked defeated, Sarah looked furious, and the rest of the room was watching the drama unfold with the fascination that comes from witnessing someone else's conflict. The auctioneer gave them every opportunity to continue bidding, but Tyler had reached his limit. When the gavel came down, awarding the mash tun to bidder number 47, I could see Sarah's hands clenched into fists in her lap. But the real shock came during the final phase of the auction, when they began selling the smaller personal items that had been mixed in with the business equipment. Lot number 45 was a collection of brewing books and journals, including the leather-bound notebook where I'd recorded every recipe I'd ever developed. The starting bid was modest, just $50, and several people showed interest. Janet raised her paddle first, probably thinking these were items she could win without much competition. David joined the bidding at $75, and I could see the conflict in Janet's face as she realized she was bidding against my brother for something that clearly had sentimental value. The price climbed slowly to $125, with Janet holding the high bid. Then Sarah entered the auction for the first time since losing the mash tun. She raised her paddle with an aggressive motion, jumping the bid to $200. It was obvious she wasn't interested in the books themselves, but rather in denying Janet something she wanted. The vindictive nature of the bid was clear to everyone in the room. I let the bidding continue for a few more rounds, watching as the price climbed to $350, for items worth maybe a tenth of that amount. Janet looked heartbroken, clearly unable to justify spending that much on sentimental value alone. David had dropped out early, apparently unwilling to get caught up in what had become an emotional rather than economic transaction. When Sarah raised her paddle to $400 with a satisfied smirk, I decided it was time to make my first truly personal statement of the day. I raised my paddle and called out clearly enough for the entire room to hear, $500. The sound of my voice caused an immediate stir throughout the crowd. People who'd been trying to identify the mysterious high bidder all morning suddenly realized that Marcus Chen, the former owner of Cascade Brewing, had been the one systematically outbidding everyone else. Sarah's face went through a series of emotions: shock, confusion, anger, and finally something that looked like fear, as the implications began to sink in. Janet gasped audibly, her hand covering her mouth as she stared at me in disbelief. David's expression was unreadable, but I could see him calculating what my presence here meant for the narrative he'd constructed about my financial irresponsibility. Tyler looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle, probably wondering how someone who'd just gone through bankruptcy could afford to spend tens of thousands of dollars at an auction. The auctioneer, professional that she was, continued with the bidding process, despite the obvious drama unfolding in her audience. I have $500 from bidder 47. Do I hear $550? She looked directly at Sarah, giving her the opportunity to continue the fight, now that she knew who she was fighting against. But Sarah didn't raise her paddle. Instead, she stood up abruptly, grabbed her purse, and headed for the exit with Tyler close behind. I could hear her voice carrying across the room as she pushed through the crowd, saying something about not being able to believe the situation. The door slammed behind them, with enough force to rattle the windows. The auctioneer gavelled the lot closed, awarding my recipe collection back to me for $500. But more importantly, I'd made it clear to everyone in the room that I wasn't the defeated, financially ruined person they'd expected to see. I was someone with resources, someone with a plan, and someone who wasn't going to quietly disappear, while others profited from my downfall. The final lots went quickly after that, with most of the remaining bidders seeming distracted by the revelation and the drama that had just unfolded. I won several more items, including some personal photographs that had been mixed in with the business materials, and a collection of awards and certificates that represented 7 years of brewing accomplishments. When the auction concluded, I made my way to the payment table to settle my accounts. The total came to just over $38,000, a substantial sum but well within the budget I'd established when planning this operation. I wrote the check from the Clearwater Capital Holdings account, handed over my identification, and arranged for pickup of the larger items. As I completed the paperwork, Janet approached hesitantly, clearly wanting to talk, but uncertain how to begin. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I had no idea you'd be here today." I thought. She trailed off, probably realizing there was no good way to finish that sentence. "You thought I was broke and powerless," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "You thought you could come here and pick through the pieces of my business without having to face me." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "It wasn't like that. I wanted to have something to remember the good times. Before everything went wrong between us." "The good times ended when you chose sides during the divorce," I replied. "When you decided that maintaining your friendship with Sarah was more important than standing by your business partner." Janet's composure cracked slightly, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "You don't understand how difficult it was. She needed support, and you were so angry about everything." I tried to stay neutral, but neutral wasn't an option, I finished for her. "And you made your choice. Now you have to live with it." I picked up my receipt and the ownership documents for the items I'd purchased, then headed toward the exit, but I stopped and turned back one final time. "By the way, Janet," I said loudly enough for the remaining people in the room to hear, "you might want to let Sarah know that Marcus Chen isn't going anywhere. In fact, I think Millbrook is about to become a very interesting place to be in the craft brewing business." The implication was clear, and I could see the understanding dawn on her face as I walked away. This auction hadn't been about acquiring my old equipment for sentimental reasons. It had been about making sure that the people who'd abandoned me during my lowest point couldn't simply step in and profit from my downfall. More than that, it had been about sending a message that I was far from finished in this industry. The drive back to my apartment felt different than the morning journey. I had $38,000 worth of my own equipment loaded in a rented truck, but more importantly, I had something I'd lost months ago: control. The steering wheel felt solid under my hands as I navigated through downtown Millbrook, past the empty storefront that had once housed Cascade Brewing's taproom. The for lease sign still hung in the window, a constant reminder of failure that I'd avoided looking at for months. Today I slowed down and really looked at it. The space had good bones: high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and the kind of industrial charm that craft beer enthusiasts loved. The location was prime, right in the heart of the downtown district that had been slowly revitalizing over the past decade. I'd chosen it carefully when I first opened, knowing that foot traffic and visibility would be crucial for building a customer base. Now seeing it empty and available, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: possibility. My phone buzzed with a text message as I parked the truck behind my apartment building. David's name appeared on the screen, and I hesitated before opening it. "Need to talk. Can you meet me at Murphy's Bar tonight around 8? The message was typically brief, devoid of any emotion or context that might give me insight into his motivations. Murphy's Bar was neutral territory, a blue-collar establishment where neither of us would feel particularly comfortable, which probably made it perfect for whatever conversation he had in mind. I spent the afternoon cataloging my auction purchases and arranging for proper storage. The smaller items went into my apartment, but the major equipment would need warehouse space until I decided what to do with it. I'd been preparing for this possibility for weeks, researching storage facilities and making preliminary arrangements. The industrial complex on the outskirts of town offered month-to-month terms and 24-hour access, perfect for someone whose plans were still developing. As I drove the truck to the storage facility, I couldn't help but think about the faces I'd seen at the auction. Sarah's shock when she realized I'd been outbidding her all morning. Tyler's confusion as he tried to understand how someone in bankruptcy could afford to spend freely. Janet's guilt-ridden expression when she approached me afterward. But it was David's reaction that puzzled me most. He'd watched the entire revelation unfold without saying a word, his face revealing nothing about what he was thinking or feeling. The storage unit was larger than I'd initially thought I'd need, but as I began unloading equipment, I realized I might have underestimated my own ambitions. The mash tun dominated the central space, its stainless steel surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. Surrounding it, I arranged the fermentation tanks, the grain mill, and the other pieces that formed the backbone of a brewing operation. Standing there among the equipment that had once been the foundation of my dreams, I felt something stirring that I'd thought was dead: the desire to brew again. Murphy's Bar occupied a corner building in the older part of town, the kind of place that had weathered multiple economic downturns by serving cold beer and honest food to people who worked with their hands. The interior was exactly what you'd expect: dark wood paneling, neon beer signs, and the comfortable shabbiness that comes from decades of use, without pretension. David was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a half-empty pint of Budweiser in front of him. He looked up as I approached, and I could see the uncertainty in his expression. We hadn't been alone together since that explosive meeting in the lawyer's office, when years of accumulated resentment had finally boiled over into accusations and harsh words that couldn't be taken back. The waitress appeared as I sat down, and I ordered a pint of whatever they had on tap that wasn't from a corporate brewery. Old habits died hard. "Thanks for coming," David said, his voice careful and measured. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I replied honestly, "but I figured we've got things to discuss." He nodded, took a sip of his beer, and seemed to gather himself for whatever he'd planned to say. "I owe you an apology," he began, the words coming out stiff and rehearsed. "The things I said during the divorce proceedings, the way I handled everything, it wasn't right." I waited, knowing there was more coming. David had never been good at apologies, and this one felt like it was being forced out of him by circumstances rather than genuine remorse. The silence stretched between us until he continued. "I thought you were being irresponsible with money. The brewery was failing, you were fighting with Sarah, and it seemed like you were making one bad decision after another. I wanted to protect the family name, protect mom and dad from being associated with what looked like financial recklessness. So you threw me under the bus, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger that was building in my chest. I chose what I thought was the safer side, he admitted. Sarah had her act together. She had a plan, a future that looked stable. You were drowning, and I didn't want to get pulled down with you. The honesty was jarring, partly because it was more direct than David usually managed, but mostly because it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. His betrayal hadn't been emotional or personal, it had been calculated. He'd assessed the situation, determined who was likely to come out on top, and aligned himself accordingly. And now, I asked. Now I'm trying to figure out how someone who supposedly lost everything in bankruptcy just spent $40,000 at an auction. He leaned forward slightly, studying my face for clues. The Marcus I thought I knew couldn't have afforded that kind of money. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd had all day. Maybe you never knew Marcus as well as you thought you did. The waitress returned with my beer, a local IPA from a brewery 2 towns over that I'd met at a craft beer festival years ago. The taste was clean and hopeful, exactly what I needed at that moment. David watched me drink, clearly frustrated by my non-answer, but unsure how to push for more information. Look, he said finally, I know I screwed up. I know I chose wrong. But we're family, and families should be able to work through things like this. Are we family?
Asked. Because when I needed family support, you were nowhere to be found. When I was losing everything I'd worked for, you were busy protecting yourself from association with my failure. David's face reddened slightly, the way it always had when he felt cornered. That's not fair. You shut everyone out. You stopped returning calls, stopped coming to family dinners. You made it impossible for people to help you. I was depressed and overwhelmed, I said. I was trying to save my business, my marriage and my sanity all at the same time. I needed people to reach out, to check on me, to offer support without being asked. Instead, everyone just assumed I was beyond help and moved on. The conversation was heading toward familiar territory, the same circular arguments we'd had during the worst of my troubles. But something was different this time. I wasn't the desperate, defeated person who'd pleaded for understanding months ago. I had resources now, options, and the kind of clarity that comes from hitting bottom and discovering you can still get back up. What do you want from me, David? I asked directly. He hesitated, clearly having expected a different kind of conversation. I want to make things right between us. I want to be brothers again. And what does that look like to you? I don't know, he admitted. I was hoping we could figure it out together. I finished my beer and signaled the waitress for another round. The alcohol was helping to smooth the sharp edges of my anger, allowing me to think more strategically about this conversation and what it might mean for my plans. Here's what I think, I said, when the fresh beers arrived. I think you've realized that maybe you bet on the wrong horse. Sarah and Tyler's relationship seems solid now, but you're smart enough to know that relationships built on shared grievances don't always last. Janet's feeling guilty about how she treated me, which means she's not the reliable ally you thought she'd be, and somehow the brother you wrote off as a failure just demonstrated that he's got more resources and resilience than anyone expected. David didn't deny any of it, which told me my assessment was probably accurate. So what happens now? He asked. Now you get to prove that your apology means something, I said, because I'm not interested in empty gestures or family reconciliation for its own sake. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you're going to have to earn it. How? I leaned back in the booth, considering my words carefully. What I was about to say would set the tone for everything that came next, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. I'm not done in Millbrook, I said. In fact, I'm just getting started. The equipment I bought today isn't going to sit in storage gathering dust. I'm going to use it, and when I do, people in this town are going to have to choose sides again. Some of them chose wrong the first time, and they're going to get a chance to make up for it. Others, like you, are going to have to decide whether you want to be part of something new or keep clinging to the safety of the status quo. David absorbed this information, and I could see him trying to calculate what it meant for his own position in the community. You're starting another brewery. I'm exploring opportunities, I said carefully. Let's just say that the craft beer market in Millbrook is about to become more competitive. The implication was clear, and David was smart enough to understand it immediately. If I was planning to re-enter the brewing business, it would put me in direct competition with whatever Sarah and Tyler were planning. More than that, it would force everyone who distanced themselves from me during the bankruptcy to reconsider their loyalties. That sounds like it could get complicated, David said. Life's complicated, I replied. The question is whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. We finished our beers in relative silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what the future might hold. When David finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more thoughtful than it had been all evening. I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, he said. About how he always said that success wasn't about never falling down, it was about how you got back up afterward. I nodded, remembering those conversations from our childhood. Our father had been a carpenter, a man who understood the value of hard work and persistence. He died when we were both still in college, but his lessons had shaped both of our approaches to life in different ways. He also said that family should stick together through the hard times. David continued. I forgot that for a while. We both forgot a lot of things, I said. The question is whether we can remember them now, when it matters. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table toward me. It was for his construction company, the business he'd built over the past decade into one of the more successful operations in the county. Whatever you're planning, he said, if you need construction work, renovation, anything like that, I want to be your first call. Not because I'm looking for business, but because I want to be part of helping you rebuild. I picked up the card and studied it. David Chen Construction. Licensed, bonded, insured. A legitimate business built on a foundation of reliability and quality work. It represented exactly the kind of partnership I might need if my plans developed the way I hoped they would. I'll keep it in mind, I said, slipping the card into my wallet. But David, you need to understand that if you want to work with me, it can't be half-hearted. When people start choosing sides again, and they will, you're going to have to be all in. No hedging your bets, no playing both sides to protect yourself. I understand, he said, and for the first time all evening, he sounded completely sincere. We parted ways in the parking lot behind Murphy's Bar, with an agreement to talk again in a few days. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. More importantly, it was the first piece of the support network I'd need if I was going to make my plans work. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. I was reviewing storage facility contracts over coffee when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize with a Portland area code. Normally I'd let unknown numbers go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Marcus Chen. The voice was professional, female, with the kind of confidence that comes from delivering good news. Speaking, this is Amanda Rodriguez, from Pacific Coast Investors. We're a venture capital firm that specializes in food and beverage businesses. I was wondering if you might have time to meet this week to discuss a potential opportunity. I set down my coffee cup, suddenly paying very close attention. I'm sorry, I think you might have the wrong person. I recently went through bankruptcy, so I'm probably not the kind of investment candidate you're looking for. Amanda laughed, a warm sound that put me immediately at ease. Actually, Mr. Chen, you're exactly the kind of person we're looking for. We're very familiar with your background, including the circumstances that led to Cascade Brewing's closure. We're also aware of your recent activities at the bankruptcy auction, which is actually why I'm calling. The revelation that venture capitalists were tracking my movements was both flattering and slightly unnerving. I'm not sure I understand. The craft brewing industry is full of people who've never faced real adversity, Amanda explained. Success stories about entrepreneurs who had family money, perfect timing, or just got lucky. What we don't see very often is someone who's been through genuine failure and come out the other side with their skills intact and their determination stronger than ever. I walked to the window of my apartment, looking out at the town where I'd built and lost everything once already. And you think I'm that kind of person? I think the fact that you just spent $40,000 to outbid your ex-wife and former business partner for equipment you already understand better than anyone else suggests that you're not ready to give up on the brewing industry, Amanda said. The question is whether you're ready to do it right this time. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. Amanda explained that Pacific Coast Investors had been tracking the craft brewing market in smaller Oregon communities, looking for opportunities to support experienced brewers who understood both the technical and business sides of the industry. They'd been aware of Cascade Brewing's trajectory and had actually considered approaching me before the bankruptcy, but the timing hadn't been right. We don't just throw money at ideas, Amanda explained. We partner with people who've proven they can execute, even if their first attempt didn't work out perfectly. Sometimes, especially because their first attempt didn't work out perfectly. The terms she outlined were more generous than anything I'd ever imagined possible. Sufficient capital to lease and renovate a proper facility, purchase additional equipment as needed, and operate for the first year without revenue pressure. In exchange, Pacific Coast investors would take a minority stake in the business and provide ongoing strategic support. The catch, Amanda said, is that we need a complete business plan within 30 days, and we need to see evidence that you've learned from the mistakes that led to Cascade Brewing's failure. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone for a long time. 6 months ago, I'd been sleeping on a friend's couch and wondering if I'd ever work in brewing again. Now I had my equipment back, a potential investor interested in funding a new venture, and the beginning of a plan that could put me back in competition with the people who'd written me off. But more than the financial opportunity, Amanda's call had given me something I'd been missing: validation. Someone with no emotional investment in my story had looked at my track record objectively and concluded that I was worth betting on. Not despite my failure, but because of how I'd handled it. I spent the rest of the morning walking through downtown Millbrook, seeing the community with fresh eyes. The empty storefront that had housed my taproom was still available, but now I found myself considering other options as well. A larger space on the industrial side of town that could accommodate both brewing and packaging operations. A historic building near the university that might appeal to a younger demographic. Each possibility came with its own advantages and challenges, but for the first time in months, I was thinking about opportunities rather than obstacles. The afternoon brought another surprise, this one considerably less welcome. I was returning from lunch when I found Tyler Brooks waiting by my apartment building, leaning against a black pickup truck with his arms crossed in a posture that was probably meant to look casual but came across as vaguely threatening. "Marcus," he said as I approached. "Glad I caught you. We need to talk." "Do we?" I replied, making no move to unlock the building entrance. "Yesterday was a hell of a thing," Tyler said, his tone attempting friendliness but not quite achieving it. "I've got to admit you caught us all off guard. Nobody expected to see you there, much less bidding on everything." "I imagine it was quite a shock," I said mildly. Tyler shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with my lack of engagement. He'd probably planned this conversation expecting me to be defensive or apologetic, and my calm indifference was throwing off his script. "Look," he said, "I think there might have been some misunderstandings about what happened at the auction. Sarah and I weren't trying to profit off your situation or anything like that. We were just looking for some equipment for a project we're working on." "What kind of project?" "A small brewing setup," Tyler said, watching my face carefully for a reaction. "Nothing major, just something to supply a few local restaurants. Very limited scale." The lie was so transparent that I almost laughed. The equipment they'd been bidding on wasn't suitable for a small operation supplying a few restaurants. The mash tun alone was designed for production volumes that would require significant distribution networks. But I kept my expression neutral and let Tyler continue digging his hole deeper. "The thing is," he continued, "we'd invested a lot of time researching the equipment, getting our financing in place, planning out the whole operation. When you started outbidding us yesterday, it kind of threw a wrench into our timeline." "That's unfortunate," I said. "So I was thinking maybe we could work something out," Tyler said, finally getting to the real purpose of his visit. "You obviously don't need all that equipment right away, and we're ready to move forward immediately. Maybe we could arrange some kind of lease agreement, or even a partnership." The audacity was breathtaking. He was proposing that I rent my own equipment back to the man who was sleeping with my ex-wife, so they could start the brewery that I should have been running. It was exactly the kind of proposal that would have sent me into a rage 6 months ago, but now I found it more amusing than infuriating. "That's an interesting idea," I said, "but I think I'll hold on to the equipment for now. You never know when opportunities might arise." Tyler's friendly facade cracked slightly. "Come on, Marcus, be realistic. You just went through bankruptcy. Starting another brewery isn't exactly a smart financial move right now. You might be surprised what smart financial moves look like," I replied. "But thanks for the advice." I turned toward the building entrance, effectively ending the conversation. Tyler called after me as I reached the door. "This doesn't have to be complicated, Marcus. There's room for more than one brewery in this town. I turned back to face him one last time. You're absolutely right, Tyler. There is room for more than one brewery in this town. The question is which ones will succeed and which ones won't. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I could hear Tyler's truck starting up in the parking lot. His visit had been illuminating in several ways. First, it confirmed that he and Sarah were indeed planning a brewing operation, not just casually shopping for equipment. Second, it suggested that their financing might not be as solid as they'd pretended, if they were willing to consider leasing arrangements with their primary competition. Most importantly, it told me that they were worried about my plans, worried enough to send Tyler as an advance scout to try to neutralize the threat. The rest of the week passed in a blur of planning and preparation. I spent hours working on the business plan that Pacific Coast investors would need, drawing on everything I'd learned from Cascade Brewing's failures, to create a more robust and sustainable model. I researched potential locations, updated my understanding of current market conditions, and began reaching out to former suppliers and distributors who might be interested in working with me again. The responses to those calls were revealing. Some people were enthusiastic about the possibility of my return to brewing, eager to work with someone they knew could produce quality products. Others were more cautious, clearly concerned about associating with someone who'd recently gone through bankruptcy. A few were openly skeptical, questioning whether I'd learned enough from my mistakes to avoid repeating them. But the most interesting conversations were with people who'd heard rumors about Sarah and Tyler's plans. The craft brewing community in Oregon was small enough that word traveled quickly about new ventures, and apparently their project was generating mixed reactions. Some people were excited about additional competition and innovation in the market. Others were questioning whether there was room for another brewery in a town that had recently seen one fail. By Friday afternoon, I had the first draft of my business plan complete, and a short list of 3 potential locations for the new brewery. More importantly, I had a clear sense of the competitive landscape I'd be entering, and the advantages I could leverage. Experience with the local market, relationships with suppliers and distributors, and most crucially, a deep understanding of what had gone wrong the first time. The weekend brought one final surprise, this one more welcome than Tyler's visit, but equally significant for my plans. I was reviewing lease agreements when my phone rang, showing Janet's name on the caller ID. I hesitated before answering, unsure what kind of conversation this would be. Marcus, her voice was tentative, uncertain. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. It's fine, Janet. What can I do for you? I was wondering if we could meet somewhere and talk, she said. There are things I need to say, things I should have said months ago. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory that didn't carry emotional baggage for either of us. Janet was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a large coffee and a nervous expression. She looked older than I remembered, worn down by whatever internal struggles she'd been facing since Cascade Brewing's closure. "Thank you for coming," she said, as I sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm here," I said simply. Janet took a deep breath, and seemed to steel herself for what came next. "I owe you an apology, Marcus. A real one, not the surface-level politeness I tried at the auction. I betrayed you when you needed me most, and I've been carrying that guilt for months." The directness was surprising. Janet had always been more diplomatic in her communication, someone who preferred to smooth over conflicts rather than confront them head-on. This version of her, raw and honest, was someone I hadn't seen before. "What changed?" I asked. "I realized that choosing Sarah's side wasn't actually about supporting a friend," Janet said. "It was about protecting myself. She seemed to have her life figured out, and you were struggling with everything falling apart. I thought aligning with her would keep me safe from the fallout. And now I see that safety isn't the same thing as integrity," she said. "And I see that the person I thought was struggling actually had more strength and resilience than any of us gave him credit for." We talked for nearly 2 hours, working through the complex emotions and practical considerations that had driven us apart. Janet explained how difficult it had been to watch our friendship deteriorate, but also how afraid she'd been of getting pulled into the drama of my divorce and business failure. I shared my own perspective on feeling abandoned by someone I'd trusted completely, and how that betrayal had been almost as painful as losing the business itself. But more importantly, we talked about the future. Janet had been working freelance consulting since Cascade Brewing closed, helping other small businesses with operations and logistics. She was good at it, but she missed the collaborative environment of being part of a team working toward a shared goal. If you're serious about starting another brewery, she said, as our conversation wound down, I'd like to be part of it. Not just as an employee, but as a partner, someone with a real stake in the success of the venture. The offer was tempting, but I'd learned to be cautious about mixing personal relationships with business decisions. That's something we could explore, I said carefully. But if we're going to work together again, it would have to be different than before. Clear agreements about roles and responsibilities, honest communication about problems before they become crises, and absolute loyalty to the business and to each other. I understand, Janet said, and I'm ready for that kind of partnership if you are. As I drove home that evening, I found myself thinking about how much had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, I'd been a spectator at the auction of my own failure, watching strangers bid on the remnants of my dreams. Now I had my equipment back, a potential investor ready to fund a new venture, a brother trying to make amends for past betrayals, and a former business partner, asking for a chance to rebuild our professional relationship. More than the external changes, though, I could feel something shifting inside myself. The anger and resentment that had been driving me for months were beginning to transform into something more productive: determination, strategic thinking, and a clear vision of what I wanted to accomplish. The people who'd counted me out were about to discover that Marcus Chen wasn't finished in Millbrook. In fact, he was just getting started. Monday morning arrived, with the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel possible. I'd spent the weekend finalizing my business plan for Pacific Coast investors, and the document now sat on my kitchen table like a roadmap to redemption. 3 years of hard-earned lessons, distilled into 47 pages of market analysis, financial projections, and operational strategies that addressed every mistake I'd made with Cascade Brewing. The phone call from Amanda Rodriguez came at exactly 9 o'clock, punctual in the way that serious investors always were. Marcus, I've had a chance to review your preliminary materials. Can you be in Portland Wednesday afternoon for a formal presentation? Absolutely, I replied, though my stomach immediately began churning with nervous energy. Excellent, we'll have our full investment committee present, which means you'll need to be prepared for detailed questions about every aspect of your plan. These people have seen hundreds of pitches, so they'll be looking for evidence that you understand not just brewing, but business fundamentals. After she hung up, I stood in my small kitchen holding the phone, struck by the surreal nature of the situation. 18 months ago, I'd been running a successful brewery, with a beautiful wife, and what seemed like a bright future. 12 months ago, I was watching that same brewery circle the drain, while my marriage collapsed around me. 6 months ago, I was sleeping on a friend's couch, wondering if I'd ever work in the industry again. Now I was preparing to pitch venture capitalists on funding my comeback. The next 2 days passed in intensive preparation. I rehearsed my presentation until I could deliver it without notes, researched every member of Pacific Coast Investors' team, and stress-tested my financial projections from every angle I could imagine. But Tuesday evening brought an unexpected complication that threatened to derail everything. I was reviewing market penetration strategies when someone knocked on my door with the aggressive rhythm that suggested trouble. Through the peephole, I could see a woman I didn't recognize, holding an official-looking envelope. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, and had the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering unpleasant news. "Marcus Chen?" she asked when I opened the door. "Yes, you're being served with a civil complaint," she said, handing me the envelope. "Have a good evening." The papers inside made my blood run cold. Sarah was suing me for intentional interference with business relations, claiming that my actions at the bankruptcy auction had been designed to prevent her from pursuing legitimate business opportunities. She was seeking damages of $50,000 plus attorney fees, and requesting an injunction that would prevent me from operating any brewing business within 50 miles of Millbrook. I read through the complaint 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of legal sophistication that suggested Sarah had invested seriously in this attack. The allegations were crafted carefully, painting my auction bidding as malicious interference rather than legitimate business activity. Most damaging was a section claiming that I had used hidden assets to outbid her, suggesting fraudulent concealment during bankruptcy proceedings. The timing was clearly intentional. Filing the lawsuit 2 days before my investor presentation was designed to create maximum disruption, forcing me to deal with legal problems when I should be focusing on securing funding. It was a strategic move that demonstrated Sarah understood exactly how to hit me where it would hurt most. I spent the rest of the evening on the phone with lawyers, trying to find someone who could help me respond quickly enough to prevent the lawsuit from derailing my investor meeting. The third attorney I called, Rebecca Martinez, from a firm in Eugene, agreed to review the complaint immediately and provide emergency consultation. "This is a nuisance suit," Rebecca told me after reading through the documents. "The legal theories are weak, and the damages are speculative, but that doesn't mean it won't cause you problems in the short term. Can they actually get an injunction preventing me from opening a brewery?" "Unlikely but not impossible," Rebecca said. "The standard for a temporary restraining order is lower than for permanent relief. If they can convince a judge that you're causing immediate harm to their business prospects, they might get a short-term order while the case proceeds." "How long would that take to resolve?" "If we fight it aggressively, probably 6 to 8 months. If we let it drag out, could be 2 years." The implications were clear. Even if I ultimately won the lawsuit, the uncertainty and legal costs could scare away potential investors and delay my plans indefinitely. Sarah had found a way to weaponize the legal system against me, using my own success at the auction as ammunition. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "We file an immediate motion to dismiss, argue that your auction bidding was legitimate business activity, and request sanctions against their attorney for filing a frivolous lawsuit. In the meantime, you proceed with your business plans, as if this complaint doesn't exist. And if the judge disagrees, then we fight harder," Rebecca said simply. Wednesday morning found me driving toward Portland, with a lawsuit hanging over my head, and a presentation that could determine my future. The contrast between the autumn beauty of the Oregon countryside and the stress churning in my stomach was almost comical. Rolling hills covered in fall foliage stretched out on both sides of the highway, while my mind raced through worst-case scenarios involving legal judgments and failed investor meetings. The offices of Pacific Coast investors occupied the top floor of a downtown Portland high-rise, all glass walls and contemporary furniture that spoke of serious money managed by serious people. Amanda Rodriguez met me in the lobby, and I was struck again by her combination of professional competence and genuine warmth. She was someone who'd clearly succeeded in a challenging industry without losing her humanity in the process. "Ready for this?" she asked as we rode the elevator to the conference room. "As ready as I can be," I replied, though the lawsuit papers in my briefcase felt like they were burning a hole through the leather. The investment committee consisted of 5 people. 3 men and 2 women, ranging in age from early 30s to late 50s. They introduced themselves with the kind of casual confidence that comes from having enough money to take calculated risks on interesting opportunities. Amanda took her seat at the head of the table and gestured for me to begin. My presentation lasted 45 minutes, covering everything from market analysis to production planning to financial projections. I explained how Cascade Brewing's failure had taught me valuable lessons about cash flow management, customer acquisition costs, and the importance of maintaining adequate reserves for unexpected challenges. Most importantly, I demonstrated how those lessons had shaped a more conservative but sustainable business model for the new venture. The questions that followed were probing but fair. They wanted to understand my assessment of the local competition, my strategies for differentiating products in a crowded market, and my plans for scaling operations if the business succeeded. Several committee members had clearly done their own research on the craft brewing industry in Oregon, and their questions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the challenges I'd be facing. But it was the final question that cut straight to the heart of my situation. A woman named Patricia Hoffman, who'd been mostly silent during the presentation, leaned forward and spoke directly. "Marcus, we're impressed with your business plan and your lessons learned from previous experience, but we're also aware that you're currently involved in litigation related to your auction activities. How should that affect our assessment of this investment opportunity?" The room fell silent. I'd been dreading this moment since receiving the lawsuit papers, but I'd also been preparing for it. This was where honesty would either save my chances or destroy them completely. "You're referring to the civil complaint filed by my ex-wife," I said. "I received
those papers 2 days ago, clearly timed to disrupt this presentation. The lawsuit alleges that my bidding at the bankruptcy auction constituted interference with her business plans." I pulled out a copy of the complaint and slid it across the table to Patricia. "My attorney has reviewed these allegations and considers them frivolous. I was bidding on my own equipment at a public auction, using my own funds for my own legitimate business purposes. There's nothing illegal or unethical about outbidding someone else at an auction, regardless of who that person is." Amanda picked up the document and scanned through it quickly. "This does seem like a fairly transparent attempt to interfere with your business plans," she said. "That's exactly what it is," I replied. "The timing makes that clear.
Filing 2 days before this meeting wasn't coincidental. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. How are you planning to handle it? Aggressively and quickly, I said. My attorney is filing motions to dismiss and requesting sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. We expect this to be resolved within 60 days, and we're confident about the outcome. The committee members exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that happen between people who've worked together for years. Finally, Amanda spoke for the group. We appreciate your transparency about the legal situation, she said. It actually reinforces our assessment that you're someone who faces challenges head-on, rather than trying to hide from them. Patricia smiled for the first time since I'd entered the room. The fact that your ex-wife is this concerned about your business plans suggests that you might be onto something significant. The rest of the meeting focused on practical details. Timeline for funding decisions, due diligence requirements, and potential terms for an investment agreement. When I left the building 2 hours later, I felt cautiously optimistic about my chances, despite the legal cloud hanging over everything. The drive back to Millbrook gave me time to process what had happened and plan my next moves. The investors had been more receptive than I dared to hope, but I knew their final decision would depend heavily on how quickly I could resolve the lawsuit. Sarah had succeeded in creating uncertainty, but she'd also revealed her hand. She was scared enough of my plans to take desperate legal action, which meant she recognized the threat I represented. My phone rang as I reached the outskirts of town. David's name appeared on the screen, and I answered, expecting a routine check-in about our tentative reconciliation. Marcus, we've got a problem, he said without preamble. Sarah and Tyler are moving faster than we expected. What do you mean? I just came from the planning office. They filed permit applications yesterday for renovating the old Millbrook feed building on Industrial Boulevard. Full commercial kitchen, brewing equipment, taproom seating for 80 people. The news hit me like a physical blow. The old feed building was perfect for a brewery operation with high ceilings, loading dock access, and plenty of room for expansion. More importantly, it was located in the industrial district, where zoning wouldn't be an issue and noise complaints would be minimal. How are you know all this? I asked. Construction permit applications are public record. Plus, I know the guys at the planning office. They mentioned it when I was there this morning on another job. What kind of timeline are we looking at? If they push everything through quickly, they could be open in 6 months, maybe 4 if they cut corners. The implications were staggering. While I was dealing with lawsuits and investor presentations, Sarah and Tyler were moving forward with concrete steps to establish their brewery. If they opened before I could get my operation running, they'd have first-mover advantage in a market that might not be big enough to support 2 competing craft breweries. There's something else, David said. I heard they've been reaching out to some of your former suppliers and distributors. Apparently, they're telling people that you're not reliable, that your bankruptcy proves you can't manage a business successfully. The systematic nature of their campaign was becoming clear. The lawsuit was just one prong of a broader strategy designed to prevent my comeback. They were attacking my reputation, my legal standing, and my access to the resources I'd need to compete effectively. David, I need you to do something for me, I said. Name it. Start putting together a bid package for renovating the old Riverside warehouse on 2nd Street. Full brewery build-out, tap room, kitchen, everything we'd need for a complete operation. There was a pause while David processed this request. Marcus, that's a huge project. We're talking about serious money, major construction, months of work. I know exactly what we're talking about, I said. The question is whether you're ready to commit to it. Are you sure about this? Because once we start down this path, there's no going back to playing it safe. I stopped playing it safe the day I spent $40,000 at that auction, I replied. If Sarah and Tyler want to make this a race, then we're going to give them one hell of a competition. The rest of the week passed in a blur of activity. Rebecca Martinez filed our motion to dismiss the lawsuit along with a strongly worded request for sanctions. David began preliminary site surveys of the Riverside warehouse. I reached out to every contact in my network, rebuilding relationships and gathering intelligence on Sarah and Tyler's operation. The intelligence gathering proved particularly illuminating. Tyler had been telling people that their brewery would focus on traditional styles done right, a not-so-subtle dig at what he characterized as my tendency toward experimental brewing. Sarah had been emphasizing their stable financial backing and professional management approach, clear references to my bankruptcy and business failure. But the most interesting information came from unexpected sources. Janet had maintained friendships with several people in the craft brewing community, and those connections were proving valuable for understanding Sarah and Tyler's plans. According to her sources, their financing wasn't as solid as they'd been claiming. They were operating on a tight budget and hoping to bootstrap their way to profitability quickly. They're also having problems with their head brewer, Janet told me during a coffee meeting Friday afternoon. Apparently, they hired someone from Portland who's never worked in a small-town operation before. There are personality conflicts, disagreements about recipes, concerns about production capacity. This kind of inside information was gold in a competitive situation. If Sarah and Tyler were dealing with internal problems while also trying to establish their business, it created opportunities for me to exploit their weaknesses. "What about suppliers?" I asked. "Mixed results," Janet said. "Some people are willing to work with them, especially if they offer better payment terms than what they had with Cascade Brewing. But others remember you fondly and are hoping you'll make a comeback. And distributors? That's where they're having real problems," Janet said, with a slight smile. "Most of the regional distributors want to see a track record before committing to a new brewery. Without existing sales data, they're not willing to guarantee shelf space or promotional support." This was exactly the kind of competitive advantage I'd been hoping to find. Distribution relationships were crucial for any brewery hoping to expand beyond local sales, and they took years to build. My existing relationships in that area might be enough to offset Sarah and Tyler's first mover advantage. The week ended with two significant developments. First, Rebecca called to inform me that the judge had scheduled a hearing on our motion to dismiss the lawsuit for the following Tuesday. It was faster than expected, which she interpreted as a good sign. "Judges don't like to waste time on weak cases," she explained. "If he's willing to hear our motion quickly, it suggests he might be inclined to dispose of this matter efficiently." The second development came in the form of an email from Amanda Rodriguez. Pacific Coast investors had completed their preliminary due diligence and were prepared to move forward with funding, contingent on resolution of the legal issues. They were offering terms that were even better than what we'd discussed initially, including enough capital to accelerate the timeline for opening. "We believe this legal challenge actually validates the investment thesis. Competition is taking you seriously enough to try to stop you, which suggests significant market opportunity," Amanda wrote. Saturday morning found me standing in the empty Riverside warehouse, imagining how the space would look transformed into a modern brewing facility. The building had good bones, solid construction from the era when things were built to last. High ceilings with exposed beams that would create the kind of atmosphere craft beer enthusiasts loved. Loading dock access for raw materials and finished products. Office space that could accommodate administrative functions and private events. David arrived with architectural drawings and preliminary cost estimates that took my breath away. The renovation would require nearly every dollar of the potential investment from Pacific Coast investors, leaving very little margin for error or unexpected expenses. It was exactly the kind of all-in commitment that had made me nervous during my first brewery venture. But this time was different. I had better financial planning, more realistic projections, and most importantly, hard-earned wisdom about what could go wrong and how to prevent it. The partnership with Pacific Coast investors would provide not just funding, but ongoing strategic support from people who understood the industry. "It's a big risk," David said as we walked through the space, "but it's also a hell of an opportunity." The biggest risk would be playing it safe. Sarah and Tyler are counting on me being too scared or too broke to compete with them effectively. They're about to discover how wrong they are. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. I was reviewing supplier contracts when Janet knocked on my door, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with nervousness.
I've been thinking about our conversation, she said when I let her in, about partnering on the new brewery. And I want to make a formal proposal, she said, setting the wine on my kitchen counter. I've put together a partnership agreement that I think addresses all the concerns you raised about clear roles and shared responsibility. The document she handed me was thorough and professional, outlining everything from day-to-day operational duties to profit-sharing arrangements to procedures for resolving disputes. It was the work of someone who'd learned from past mistakes and was serious about preventing them from reoccurring. I'm also prepared to make a significant financial investment, Janet continued, $25,000 in cash, plus sweat equity in overseeing daily operations, renovation, and startup phases. The money wasn't the most important part of her offer, though it would certainly help with cash flow during the critical early months. What mattered more was her commitment to the venture and her willingness to put her own resources at risk. It was exactly the kind of partnership I needed with someone whose skills complemented my own. "This is impressive work," I said, after reading through the agreement. "You've obviously put a lot of thought into this." "I've had months to think about what went wrong between us before," Janet said. "I don't want to make those mistakes again." We spent the rest of the evening working through the details of a potential partnership, discussing everything from brewing schedules to marketing strategies to conflict resolution procedures. By the time Janet left, we'd agreed in principle to move forward together, pending successful resolution of the lawsuit and confirmation of investor funding. Sunday passed quietly, giving me time to prepare for the legal hearing that would determine whether Sarah's lawsuit could derail my plans. I reviewed all the documents with Rebecca one final time, making sure I understood every aspect of our legal strategy and preparing for the questions I might face from the judge. But as I fell asleep that night, I found myself thinking less about legal arguments and more about the broader competition that was developing. Sarah and Tyler had thrown down the gauntlet, challenging me to prove that my comeback was real rather than just desperate posturing. They'd underestimated my resources, my determination, and my ability to learn from past mistakes. Over the next few months, the craft brewing community in Millbrook would witness something that rarely happened in small business. Two experienced teams racing to establish competing operations in a market that might not be big enough for both. Only one of us would succeed in building a sustainable business, and I was determined to make sure it was me. The battle for Millbrook's brewing future was about to begin in earnest, and I had every intention of winning it. Tuesday morning arrived with the weight of destiny hanging in the courthouse air. Judge Patricia Hernandez had a reputation for efficiency and zero tolerance for frivolous litigation, which Rebecca assured me was exactly what we needed. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a harsh, institutional feel. Sarah sat with her attorney at the plaintiff's table, looking polished and confident in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Richard Blackstone, had the kind of expensive briefcase and perfectly groomed appearance that screamed high-dollar litigation. They'd clearly invested serious money in this attack, which told me they considered me a genuine threat. Rebecca and I took our seats at the defendant's table, and I felt the familiar churning in my stomach that came with high-stakes moments. Everything I'd been working toward for the past month could be decided in the next hour. If Judge Hernandez granted even a temporary restraining order, it would scare away Pacific Coast investors and give Sarah and Tyler months of head start on their brewing operation. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Hernandez entered the courtroom. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd heard every possible legal argument during her career. She settled behind the bench and immediately got to business. "I've reviewed the pleadings in this matter, and I'm prepared to hear oral arguments on defendant's motion to dismiss. Counsel for plaintiff, you may proceed." Blackstone stood and launched into a polished presentation about the sanctity of business relationships and the damage caused by intentional interference. He painted my auction bidding as a malicious campaign designed to destroy Sarah's legitimate business opportunities, emphasizing the personal nature of our relationship and suggesting vindictiveness had motivated my actions. Your Honor, the defendant's conduct at the bankruptcy auction was clearly designed to prevent Ms. Chen from acquiring equipment necessary for her brewing operation. His bidding patterns show systematic interference with every item she attempted to purchase, driving prices to unreasonable levels solely to cause her financial harm. It was a skillful argument that twisted the facts just enough to sound plausible without being provably false. Blackstone was earning his fee by making my legitimate business activities sound like a personal vendetta. When Rebecca stood to respond, her approach was refreshingly direct. Your Honor, this case is about one simple question. Does bidding at a public auction constitute legally actionable interference with business relations? The answer is clearly no. She laid out our argument methodically, emphasizing that public auctions were designed to allow competitive bidding and that the highest bidder had every right to purchase available items. The personal relationship between Sarah and I was irrelevant to the legal question of whether auction bidding could constitute tortious interference. Plaintiff is essentially arguing that she had a superior right to purchase items at a public auction simply because she wanted them. That's not how auctions work, and it's certainly not how the law works. Mr. Chen had every right to bid on his own equipment using his own money for his own legitimate business purposes. Judge Hernandez listened carefully to both arguments, occasionally asking pointed questions that suggested she understood the underlying dynamics. When she asked Blackstone to cite legal precedent for his interference theory, his response was notably weaker than his opening presentation. There simply weren't many cases where auction bidding had been successfully challenged as business interference. The hearing lasted 90 minutes, with most of the time spent on technical legal arguments about the elements required to prove tortious interference. But the moment that changed everything came when Judge Hernandez asked me to speak directly. Your Honor, I'd like to hear in your own words why you attended that auction and what you intended to accomplish. I stood, feeling the weight of Sarah's stare from across the courtroom. This was my chance to tell the truth simply and clearly, without legal jargon or strategic spin. Your Honor, I attended the auction to buy back equipment that I spent years acquiring for my brewery. Every piece of equipment in that sale represented months of saving and careful selection. When my business failed, it was devastating to lose not just the company, but all the tools I'd need to start over. I paused, making sure my voice remained steady and professional.
Resources to attend the auction, it never occurred to me that I wouldn't bid on items I needed for my own future business plans. The fact that my ex-wife was also bidding was unfortunate, but it didn't change my right to participate in a public sale. Judge Hernandez nodded thoughtfully. And did you have specific business plans for this equipment at the time of the auction? Yes, Your Honor. I was already in discussions with potential investors and developing plans for a new brewing operation. The equipment purchases were part of that planning process. Thank you, Mr. Chen. You may be seated. The judge called for a brief recess to review her notes, and Rebecca and I stepped into the hallway to wait. Through the courthouse windows, I could see the Millbrook downtown district where both Sarah and I were planning to establish competing businesses. In a few months, those streets would either see my triumphant return to brewing or my final defeat at the hands of people who'd counted me out once before. How do you think it went? I asked Rebecca. Better than I expected, she said. The judge asked good questions, and your testimony was exactly what we needed. Honest, straightforward, and focused on legitimate business purposes rather than personal grievances. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Hernandez had clearly made her decision. She spoke directly and decisively with the confidence of someone who'd seen similar cases many times before. The court finds that defendant's motion to dismiss should be granted in its entirety, she announced. Participation in a public auction, regardless of the bidder's personal relationships with other participants, cannot constitute tortious interference with business relations as a matter of law. The relief that flooded through me was almost overwhelming. Sarah's face had gone pale, and Blackstone was already whispering urgently in her ear about appeals and alternative strategies. But Judge Hernandez wasn't finished.
Furthermore, she continued, the court finds that this lawsuit was filed without substantial justification and appears to have been intended primarily to harass defendant and interfere with his own business plans. Accordingly, the court awards defendant reasonable attorney fees and costs to be paid by plaintiff within 30 days. The sanctions were the final blow to Sarah's legal strategy. Not only had she failed to stop my business plans, but she'd been ordered to pay for the privilege of losing. As Rebecca and I gathered our papers, I could hear Blackstone trying to explain to Sarah why an appeal would be both expensive and unlikely to succeed. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca was practically glowing with professional satisfaction. That was about as complete a victory as we could have hoped for, she said. The judge didn't just dismiss the case, she essentially called it frivolous and ordered them to pay our fees. What does this mean for my business plans? It means you're free to proceed without legal interference, Rebecca said. And it means that if they try any similar tactics in the future, they'll face immediate sanctions. I called Amanda Rodriguez from the courthouse parking lot, and her response was exactly what I'd been hoping to hear. Congratulations, Marcus! We're prepared to finalize funding immediately. Can you be in Portland Thursday afternoon to sign the investment documents? The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of legal paperwork, financial arrangements, and construction planning. David had finalized his renovation estimates for the Riverside warehouse, and the timeline he proposed was aggressive but achievable. If everything went according to plan, we could be open for business within 4 months. Janet and I formalized a partnership agreement, with her bringing not just financial investment, but operational expertise that would be crucial during the startup phase. Her network of industry contacts had already proven valuable for supplier relationships and market intelligence. But the most satisfying moment came Thursday evening when I called my parents to tell them about the legal victory and the secured funding. They'd been supportive throughout my troubles, but I could hear the relief in their voices as they realized their son wasn't just surviving his setbacks, but actually thriving because of them. "We're proud of you," my father said simply. "Not just for the business success, but for how you've handled everything. That takes real character." The construction phase that followed was intense and exhausting, but also deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. Watching the empty warehouse transform into a modern brewing facility felt like watching my dreams take physical form. David's crew worked with the kind of precision and dedication that comes from personal investment in the outcome. The brewing equipment installation was particularly emotional for me. Seeing the stainless steel tanks and copper piping arranged in their new home, connected by gleaming pipes and controlled by state-of-the-art monitoring systems, felt like a resurrection. These weren't just tools for making beer, they were symbols of resilience and determination. Word of our progress spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit business community. Some people were excited about the return of local craft brewing, while others questioned whether the market could support two competing operations. The uncertainty created by competing plans had some suppliers and distributors hedging their bets, waiting to see which venture would establish itself more successfully. But the most interesting development was the effect our rapid progress had on Sarah and Tyler's operation. According to Janet's intelligence network, they were experiencing significant delays and cost overruns in their renovation project. Their head brewer had quit after disagreements about production methods, leaving them scrambling to find qualified replacement talent. They're also having trouble with their financing, Janet reported during one of our weekly planning meetings. Apparently, their investors are getting nervous about the increased competition and asking harder questions about market viability. The psychological pressure was clearly affecting their decision-making. Instead of focusing on building the best possible brewery, they seemed to be making reactive choices designed to counter our moves. When they heard about our planned grand opening, they announced an earlier timeline that proved to be unrealistic. When we secured exclusive agreements with certain suppliers, they overpaid for alternative arrangements that strained their budget. 2 months into construction, I received a call that proved how much the competitive dynamics had shifted in our favor. Tyler's voice was strained and formal when he identified himself, lacking the confident tone he'd used during our previous confrontations. "Marcus, I think we should meet and discuss the situation," he said. "This competition isn't good for either of our businesses or for the community." We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a diner on the outskirts of town that neither of us frequented. Tyler looked older than I remembered, worn down by the stress of trying to establish a business while competing against someone with superior resources and experience. "Look," he said after we'd ordered coffee. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. There's no reason we can't both succeed in this market." "That depends on what success looks like to you," I replied. "I'm talking about coexistence," Tyler said. "Maybe we focus on different market segments, different styles of beer, different customer bases." The proposal was exactly what I'd expected. Tyler was trying to negotiate a truce from a position of weakness, hoping to avoid the head-to-head competition that would likely destroy his operation. But I'd learned valuable lessons about the importance of decisive action when opportunities presented themselves. "Tyler, I appreciate the sentiment," I said, "but the market will decide which of our businesses succeeds. I'm not interested in artificial arrangements that limit either of our potentials." His face hardened slightly. "You're making a mistake, Marcus. This town isn't big enough for both of us to succeed long term." "You're probably right about that," I agreed, "but I like my chances better than yours." The conversation ended cordially, but with clear understanding that the competition would continue without compromise. Tyler left looking like a man who'd played his final card and found it insufficient. 3 weeks before our planned opening, Sarah made her own attempt at direct negotiation. She showed up at the brewery during construction, wearing jeans and a sweater that made her look more like the woman I'd once married, and less like the polished businesswoman she'd become. "Can we talk?" she asked when I met her at the entrance. We walked through the nearly completed facility, with Sarah commenting on the quality of the renovation and the sophistication of the equipment. Her tone was carefully neutral, but I could sense her calculating the costs and comparing them to her own operation. "This is impressive," she said finally. "You've built something really special here." "Thank you." "Marcus, I owe you an apology," she continued. "The lawsuit was a mistake. I was scared about the competition, and I let that fear drive me to make a bad decision." The apology was more direct than I'd expected, but it came too late to change the fundamental dynamics between us. Too much had happened. Too many lines had been crossed for a simple apology to reset our relationship. "I appreciate that," I said, "but apologies don't undo actions. You made your choice when you decided to file that lawsuit." "What if we could find a way to work together instead of against each other?" Sarah asked. "Our operations could complement each other rather than compete." "How?" "Different markets, different distribution channels, maybe even some collaborative products. The craft brewing community is supposed to be supportive of each other." The irony was thick. Sarah was asking for the kind of mutual support she'd refused to provide during my darkest period. She wanted cooperation now that she realized her operation was at a disadvantage. But she'd shown no interest in collaboration when she thought she held all the cards. "Sarah, I had the chance to be supportive when I needed it most. Instead, you chose to distance yourself from my problems and build relationships with my competitors. Now you want cooperation because it serves your interests?" She looked down at her hands, clearly struggling with the reality of the situation she'd created. "I know I made mistakes during the divorce. I know I hurt you."
You. But this is bigger than our personal issues. No, it's not, I replied. This is exactly about personal issues. Trust, loyalty, integrity, keeping your word when things get difficult. Those aren't just personal qualities, they're business fundamentals. Sarah left without getting the assurance she'd come looking for, and I could see in her expression that she finally understood the full consequences of her choices. The competitive battle she'd helped create would continue to its conclusion, regardless of her late arriving regrets. The grand opening of Millbrook Brewing Company took place on a crisp November evening, exactly 6 months after the bankruptcy auction that had started everything. The renovated warehouse looked spectacular, with warm lighting highlighting the copper brewing vessels and exposed brick walls. Local musicians provided live entertainment while customers sampled our initial beer offerings and toured the production facilities. The turnout exceeded our most optimistic projections. Local business owners, craft beer enthusiasts from surrounding communities, and former Cascade Brewing customers who'd missed having a hometown brewery all showed up to celebrate. Even some of my former skeptics attended, drawn by curiosity about whether I could succeed on my second attempt. Amanda Rodriguez made the trip from Portland with several members of Pacific Coast Investors' team, clearly pleased with how their investment had developed. "This is exactly the kind of operation we hope to support," she told the crowd during a brief speech. "A business built on experience, resilience, and deep commitment to quality.
David raised a toast to second chances and new beginnings, while Janet spoke about the importance of partnerships built on mutual respect and shared vision. But the moment that meant the most to me came when my parents cut the ceremonial ribbon, officially opening the doors of a business that represented everything I'd learned about failure, recovery, and the power of refusing to give up. The beer we served that night was the best I'd ever brewed, benefiting from years of experience and the kind of attention to detail that comes from having lost everything once before. Our flagship IPA had the perfect balance of hops and malt that I'd been trying to achieve for years. The seasonal porter was rich and complex, with notes of chocolate and coffee that lingered pleasantly. Every recipe represented not just technical skill but hard-earned wisdom about what customers really wanted. As the evening wound down and the last customers headed home with growlers of fresh beer, I stood alone in the brewery looking at what we'd accomplished. The stainless steel tanks hummed quietly with active fermentation, the beginning of our next batch of beer that would help establish our reputation in the market. 3 blocks away, Sarah and Tyler's operation remained unfinished, plagued by continued delays and budget problems that had pushed their opening date into the following spring. The competitive race that had seemed so intense just months before was effectively over before it had really begun. But more than the business success, I felt a deep satisfaction about the personal growth that had made it all possible. The man who'd attended that bankruptcy auction 6 months ago had been angry, hurt, and focused primarily on revenge against people who'd wronged him. The man standing in this brewery tonight was motivated by something healthier and more sustainable, the desire to build something excellent and lasting. Janet appeared beside me, carrying 2 glasses of our porter and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd bet everything on the right outcome. "Penny for your thoughts," she said. "I was thinking about how different this feels from the first time," I said, accepting the beer. With Cascade Brewing, I was always worried about failure, always looking over my shoulder at what could go wrong. Tonight, I feel like we've already succeeded just by getting this far. "That's because we have succeeded," Janet said. "Not just in business terms, but in proving that setbacks don't have to be permanent, that people can learn from mistakes and come back stronger." We stood there sipping our beer and watching the fermentation tanks work their magic, 2 partners who'd found their way back to each other through shared adversity and mutual respect. Outside, Millbrook slept peacefully, unaware that its craft brewing scene had just been permanently altered by someone who'd refused to accept defeat as final. The next morning brought reviews of our opening in the local newspaper and social media posts from customers sharing photos of their brewery experience. Every piece of feedback was positive, with particular praise for the quality of our beer and the atmosphere we'd created in the renovated warehouse space. But the most meaningful recognition came in the form of a handwritten note, slipped under the brewery door during the night. The message was brief and unsigned, but I recognized David's handwriting immediately. "Dad would be proud of how you fought your way back. Welcome home, brother." 6 months later, Millbrook Brewing Company had become exactly what I'd envisioned, a thriving local business that served excellent beer while contributing to the community's economic vitality. We'd expanded our distribution to restaurants and stores throughout the region, hired 6 full-time employees, and established ourselves as the premier craft brewery in our part of Oregon. Sarah and Tyler's operation had eventually opened, but their delayed launch and ongoing financial problems had prevented them from gaining significant market traction. Within a year, they'd closed and moved on to other ventures, leaving Millbrook Brewing as the undisputed leader in local craft beer production. Standing in my office one evening, looking out at the production floor, where employees were packaging the day's batch of beer, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The bankruptcy auction that had seemed like the final humiliation of my business career had actually been the first step toward a comeback that exceeded my original success. The equipment I'd bought back that day was still the heart of our operation, but it had been joined by newer tanks, better technology, and most importantly better management systems that prevented the mistakes that had doomed Cascade Brewing. Every lesson I'd learned during my failure had been incorporated into building something stronger and more sustainable. The personal relationships that had been damaged during my divorce and bankruptcy had also found new equilibrium. David and I had rebuilt our brotherhood through shared work and mutual respect. Janet had proven herself to be exactly the kind of partner I'd needed, someone whose skills complemented mine and whose commitment matched my own. Even my relationship with Sarah had evolved into something resembling professional courtesy. We acknowledged each other politely when our paths crossed in town, but without the bitterness that had characterized our interactions during the competitive period. She'd moved on to other projects, while I'd found success in the industry she'd tried to prevent me from re-entering. The evening news was running a feature story about Millbrook's economic revitalization, highlighting our brewery as an example of how local businesses could drive community growth. The reporter interviewed several customers who spoke enthusiastically about the quality of our beer and the positive impact we'd had on downtown foot traffic. But the quote that meant the most to me came from Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor from the Pinewood Apartments who'd become a regular customer despite having never shown interest in craft beer before my return to brewing. Marcus never gave up, she told the reporter. Even when everything looked hopeless, he kept working towards something better. That's the kind of person you want to support, someone who shows that hard work and determination still matter. As I locked up the brewery that night and walked to my car, I thought about all the people who'd counted me out during my lowest period. Some had been motivated by genuine concern, others by self-interest, and still others by the simple human tendency to assume that failure is permanent and irreversible. They'd all been wrong, but not because I was special or uniquely talented. They'd been wrong because they'd underestimated the power of learning from mistakes, the value of persistent effort, and the importance of refusing to accept defeat as final. The man who'd lost everything at that bankruptcy auction had become the man who'd won it all back through careful planning, strategic thinking, and the kind of determination that only comes from having nothing left to lose. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 2 years after the bankruptcy auction that had changed everything. I recognized the return address immediately, Pacific Northwest Asset Recovery, the same auction house where I'd outbid my ex-wife and former friends for my own equipment. The irony of receiving correspondence from them now, as a successful business owner, rather than a desperate man watching his dreams get sold off, wasn't lost on me. Inside the envelope was an invitation to speak at their annual conference for distressed asset professionals. The theme was second act success stories. When bankruptcy becomes beginning, and they wanted me to share my experience as someone who transformed complete business failure into something even better than the original venture. I set the invitation on my desk and walked onto the production floor of Millbrook Brewing Company, where the morning shift was already busy preparing for what would be our biggest day of production yet. We'd just signed an exclusive contract to supply craft beer to a regional restaurant chain, expanding our distribution footprint beyond anything I'd achieved with Cascade Brewing. The employees working the bottling line that morning were people I'd hired over the past 18 months, each one carefully selected, not just for their technical skills, but for their commitment to the kind of collaborative culture Janet and I had worked to establish. Unlike my first brewery, where I'd often felt isolated and overwhelmed by the responsibilities of leadership, Millbrook Brewing operated as a genuine team, where everyone understood how their individual contributions supported our collective success. Sarah Martinez, our head brewer and the talented woman who'd replaced the Portland hire that Sarah and Tyler had lost, looked up from her quality control station as I passed. "The new IPA batch is testing perfectly," she reported. "I think we finally nailed the hop balance you were looking for." The satisfaction I felt hearing those words went beyond simple business metrics. This beer represented the culmination of everything I'd learned about brewing, management, and building sustainable operations. Every recipe we produced now incorporated lessons learned from both my successes and failures during the Cascade Brewing years. My phone buzzed with a text message from David, who was finishing the final details on our expansion project. Inspection passed. We're cleared for the new taproom opening next month. The expansion would double our seating capacity and add a full kitchen, transforming us from a production brewery with limited retail into a destination restaurant that happened to make exceptional beer. The growth had been steady but manageable, funded through retained earnings, and a second round of investment from Pacific Coast investors, rather than the desperate borrowing that had eventually doomed my first venture. Amanda Rodriguez had become not just a financial partner but a trusted advisor whose experience with scaling food and beverage businesses had helped us avoid the cash flow traps that caught so many expanding operations. I returned to my office to find Janet reviewing the quarterly financial reports that we'd present to our investors the following week. The numbers told a story of sustainable profitability and controlled growth that represented everything I'd failed to achieve during my first attempt at brewery ownership. "We're ahead of projections in every category," Janet said, looking up from the spreadsheets. "Revenue, profit margins, production efficiency, customer satisfaction scores. If we maintain this trajectory, we'll be ready for the next expansion phase by spring. The partnership with Janet had evolved into something more effective than I'd dared hope during our reconciliation conversation 2 years earlier. Her operational skills perfectly complemented my brewing expertise and customer relationship abilities, creating a management team that was stronger than either of us could have been individually. More importantly, we'd learned to communicate honestly about problems before they became crises, establishing the kind of transparent working relationship that had been missing from too many of my previous business partnerships. When disagreements arose, we addressed them directly and professionally, focusing on finding solutions rather than assigning blame. There's something else we need to discuss, Janet continued, her tone shifting to something more serious. I got a call yesterday from someone asking questions about our early history, specifically about the bankruptcy auction and the competition with Sarah and Tyler's operation. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the conditioned response that came from years of dealing with unexpected complications. A journalist from Portland Business Journal is working on a feature story about entrepreneurship and resilience in small Oregon communities. Janet explained, she wants to interview you about the brewery, as an example of successful business recovery. The prospect of media attention made me uncomfortable, partly because I'd always preferred to let our beer speak for itself, rather than rely on publicity, but mostly because I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit the painful period that had preceded our current success. Did she mention Sarah and Tyler specifically? She seemed to know about the competitive situation and the legal dispute, Janet said. But her focus is on the comeback story, not the drama that led up to it. I walked to my office window, looking out at the downtown Millbrook streetscape that had become so much more vibrant since our brewery had helped anchor the district's revitalization. 3 new restaurants had opened within 2 blocks of our location, drawn by the foot traffic our taproom generated. A vintage bookstore, an artisan coffee roaster had followed, creating the kind of walkable, interesting neighborhood that young professionals sought out. The economic impact extended beyond just the businesses that had opened near us. Our employees lived in town, shopped at local stores, and contributed to community organizations. The suppliers we worked with had expanded their operations to meet our growing demand for local ingredients. Even the city government had benefited from increased tax revenue generated by our success. What do you think about the interview? I asked Janet. I think it could be good for business, she said pragmatically. But more than that, I think your story might inspire other people who are dealing with their own failures and wondering if recovery is possible. That afternoon, I called the journalist Rebecca Wong and agreed to meet with her the following week. Her preliminary questions were thoughtful and focused on the practical aspects of rebuilding after business failure, rather than the personal drama that had surrounded my divorce and bankruptcy. I'm particularly interested in the decision-making process that led you to attend the auction, she said during our phone conversation. That seems like a pivotal moment, where you chose to fight back rather than accept defeat. The observation was perceptive. The bankruptcy auction had indeed been the moment when I'd stopped being a victim of circumstances and started taking active control of my future. Everything that had followed, from securing investor funding to rebuilding personal relationships to establishing the new brewery, had flowed from that initial decision to compete for my own equipment. It wasn't really a decision at all, I told her. Once I realized I had the resources to participate, there was never any question about whether I'd bid on equipment I needed for my future plans. But you must have known it would create conflict with your ex-wife and former business partner. The conflict already existed, I replied. The auction just made it visible to everyone else. The interview took place the following Tuesday in our brewery's conference room, with Rebecca recording our conversation, while Janet provided additional context about our operational philosophy and growth strategy. Rebecca had clearly done her research, asking informed questions about craft brewing industry dynamics and the specific challenges faced by small producers in competitive markets. But the most interesting part of the conversation focused on the psychological aspects of business failure and recovery. Rebecca wanted to understand how someone moves from the despair of bankruptcy to the confidence required for a successful comeback. The key insight came when I realized that failure isn't permanent unless you accept it as permanent, I explained. Cascade Brewing failed for specific identifiable reasons. If I could address those underlying problems, there was no reason a second brewery couldn't succeed. What were the main problems with your first venture? Undercapitalization, poor cash flow management, and trying to grow too fast without adequate systems, I said. Plus some personal issues that affected my judgment during critical periods. How did you address those problems with Millbrook Brewing? Better financial planning, experienced investors who provided ongoing guidance, and a management team structure that prevented any single person from making critical decisions in isolation. Janet answered. The article was published 3 weeks later, as the cover story of Portland Business Journal's quarterly entrepreneurship issue. The headline read, "Brewing Resilience: How One Man Turned Bankruptcy into His Greatest Success," and the accompanying photograph showed me standing next to the same mash tun I'd outbid Sarah for at the auction. The story was fair and accurate, focusing on business strategy and operational lessons, rather than personal conflicts. Rebecca had interviewed several industry experts who provided context about failure and recovery rates in craft brewing, making my experience part of a broader discussion about entrepreneurship and resilience. Most gratifying were the responses from other business owners who'd faced similar challenges. Emails and phone calls poured in from people who'd lost companies, gone through bankruptcies, or were currently struggling with business problems. Many of them wanted advice about recovery strategies, while others simply expressed gratitude for proof that failure didn't have to be the end of their entrepreneurial stories. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a woman in Eastern Oregon who'd lost her restaurant during the economic downturn and had been considering giving up on business ownership entirely. Reading about your auction strategy gave me an idea for reclaiming equipment from my own closed restaurant, she wrote. I'm not ready to quit fighting yet. The speaking engagement at Pacific Northwest Asset Recovery's conference took place 6 months later, in a Portland hotel ballroom, filled with bankruptcy attorneys, asset liquidators, and distressed debt specialists. These were people who made their living from business failures, so they understood better than most how rare genuine recovery stories were. My presentation lasted 45 minutes, covering everything from the emotional impact of watching your life's work get auctioned off to the strategic thinking required for successful business recovery. I shared specific details about financial planning, team building, and the importance of learning from past mistakes rather than simply repeating familiar patterns. But the part of my talk that generated the most questions focused on the psychological transformation required to move from failure to success. Audience members wanted to understand how someone develops the confidence to risk everything again after losing it all once before. The secret isn't confidence, I told them. It's competence. When you understand exactly why your first venture failed and have concrete plans for preventing those same problems, starting over becomes a calculated risk rather than a desperate gamble. During the question and answer period, someone asked about my current relationship with the people who'd opposed my comeback efforts. It was a fair question that I'd been expecting. We coexist professionally, I said. Sarah and Tyler moved on to other projects after their brewery venture didn't work out. When we encounter each other around town, we're cordial but not friendly. Some relationships don't survive the kind of conflicts we experienced, and that's probably healthier for everyone involved. Any regrets about how you handled the competitive situation? I wish the legal dispute had been unnecessary, I replied. But I don't regret defending my right to participate in the market or compete for the same opportunities as anyone else. After the conference, Amanda Rodriguez invited me to dinner with several other Pacific Coast Investors portfolio company CEOs. The conversation that evening focused on scaling strategies and market expansion opportunities, the kind of forward-looking business discussion that would have been impossible during my Cascade Brewing days, when I was always focused on immediate survival rather than long-term growth. We're considering offering you additional funding for accelerated expansion, Amanda told me, as dinner wound down. Your operation has become a model for how we want to work with experienced entrepreneurs who've demonstrated they can learn from setbacks. The offer was tempting, but I'd learned the importance of growing at a sustainable pace, rather than accepting every available opportunity. Let me discuss it with Jan and review our capacity planning, I said. We want to make sure we're ready for the next growth phase before we commit to it. 6 months later, Millbrook Brewing Company celebrated its 3rd anniversary with a block party that shut down 2 streets of downtown Millbrook. Local businesses participated with sidewalk sales and special events, while food trucks provided dinner options to complement our beer offerings. A jazz quartet performed on a small stage we'd set up in front of the brewery, and families with children enjoyed the festival atmosphere. Standing on the brewery's loading dock, looking out at hundreds of people celebrating what our business had become, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. The man who'd attended that bankruptcy auction 3 years earlier had been broken, angry, and focused primarily on proving his enemies wrong. The man hosting this anniversary celebration was motivated by something healthier, the satisfaction of building something excellent and sustainable. David joined me on the loading dock, carrying 2 glasses of our anniversary ale, and wearing the relaxed expression of someone whose construction company had benefited significantly from our expansion projects. "Remember when you thought this town wasn't big enough for 2 breweries?" he asked. I was right, I replied. It wasn't big enough for 2 poorly run breweries. But it's been perfect for one excellent one. Janet appeared beside us, having just finished a television interview with a reporter from the regional news station. "They want to know about our expansion plans," she said. I told them we're focused on perfecting what we've already built before taking on new challenges. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the street, where a small crowd had gathered around someone I couldn't immediately identify. As people shifted, I caught a glimpse of Sarah talking with several customers and gesturing toward the brewery. I felt the familiar tension that came from unexpected encounters with my ex-wife, but it was muted now by time and success. Whatever she was discussing with those people couldn't change the fundamental reality of what we'd accomplished. "Should we go see what that's about?" David asked. "No need," I said. "She's entitled to attend a public event in her own town." Later that evening, as the cleanup crews were finishing their work and the last customers were heading home, Janet mentioned that she'd overheard part of Sarah's conversation with the crowd. "She was telling people about the early days of Cascade Brewing," Janet said. "Apparently someone recognized her and asked about her connection to you. She spoke positively about your brewing skills and the quality of what you're producing now." The information surprised me, partly because Sarah hadn't been required to say anything positive about my work, but mostly because it suggested a level of maturity and perspective that hadn't been present during our conflicts. "Did she say anything about the competitive period?" "Just that it had been a difficult time for everyone involved, and that she was glad to see the brewery thriving," Janet replied. As I locked up the brewery that night, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since the morning I'd driven to that bankruptcy auction with $40,000 and a desperate plan to reclaim my equipment. The man who'd left that community center with garbage bags full of his possessions had become the owner of the most successful craft brewery in the county. But more than the business success, I valued the personal growth that had made it all possible. The anger and resentment that had motivated my initial comeback efforts had been replaced by genuine satisfaction in building something excellent. The relationships that had been damaged during my divorce and bankruptcy had either been repaired or replaced with healthier alternatives. Most importantly, I'd learned that failure isn't the opposite of success, it's often the foundation for it. Every mistake I'd made with Cascade Brewing had taught me something valuable about brewery, financial planning, or leadership that I'd applied to building something better. The bankruptcy auction that had seemed like the final humiliation of my business career had actually been the first step toward proving that setbacks don't have to be permanent. Sometimes the best revenge against people who count you out is simply refusing to stay down. 5 years later, Millbrook Brewing Company operates 3 locations across Oregon and employs 47 people. We've won multiple awards for beer quality and business excellence, been featured in national craft brewing publications, and become a case study taught in business schools about successful recovery from failure. The equipment I bought back at that auction still forms the heart of our original production facility, though it's now surrounded by newer tanks and more sophisticated technology. Every time I walk past those original stainless steel vessels, I remember the man who'd lost everything and decided to fight for it back. That man's determination and refusal to accept defeat as final had created everything we'd become. His story proved that sometimes the best chapters of your life begin exactly when everyone else assumes the story is over. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.